Hi, this is Alyssa Hundley, and I am doing my student presentation for CIT 230 on JSON. So JSON is called JavaScript Object Notation. And basically, JSON is a way to store data that's very organized, it's extremely easy to access. It's a human readable collection of data, but it's also a collection of data that's easy for machines to read and to understand. JSON takes code and returns it as an object or an array, and I will go into that a little bit more in detail in a second. But JSON is commonly, but not exclusively, used to exchange information between web clients and web servers. It's a simple exchange format that helps to communicate between JavaScript and server-side technologies. So here's a very simple JSON example that I have. We have this object here called JSON, which I think is funny, JSON. And so JSON has a key and a value. So this age right here is the key, and it's always a string enclosed in quotation marks. And then on the other side is a value. And in this example, the value is a string, but it can be a string, a number, a Boolean expression, array, or an object. And then between the two of these is our key value pair, which always follows a very specific syntax. We have our key inside our quotes, a colon, and then the value after it. And then every key value pair is separated by a comma. And then we go to the next line and start our next key value pair until we're done there. So in my mind, this is kind of how I understand JSON to work a little bit. And this is kind of a very simple explanation of it, but this is just kind of how it makes sense to me. So if we are on the front end looking at a web page, and the front end needs information from the database. So it's asking this database here, going and saying, hey, I need this information. So the database gives information to the API. And then the API returns the necessary information to the front end in JSON format. And it's very, like I said earlier, it's very simple to read and for the server and for the front end. And then, but we can also go the other way. We can say, we have information here on the front end, like, for example, we might have a form. So in our last weather page assignment this last week, we built a form, and then our end user inputted information about the weather storm that might have been happening. And so they put that in on the front end, and then we want to submit that back into our database to store that information. So the front end will submit that information to the API in the form of JSON, and then it will then be delivered to the database. So it can go either way, from pulling information from the database or delivering information to it. And I just wanted to use an example that, I have used at work. So I work at the MTC in the technology department, and we make these apps that missionaries can use to learn their foreign language. Part of this is just a little plug for this app, Tall Drill. You can all download it on the App Store, and it's awesome, and it helps you learn any foreign language that you want, and it's mostly gospel literature. But in this example, you download this app, and then it prompts you to sign in with your LDS account. So then you're redirected to this page, and it looks just like if you were to sign into LDS.org. And so you'll put in your information on the front end here to sign in, and at that moment, we are making a request to the API to get this necessary information from the database. And then we get that info from the database to the API, and then it packages it up for us and sends it to the front end in the form of JSON. And then when that happens, the user is able to log in and see and use all of the features that are available to them. And so information that we're able to get from the database through the API in the form of JSON is like the name of the user, their account number, their LDS account information, and what rights that they have. And all of those things are used here on the front end in the form of objects in our code. And so a question is, why are we using JSON? Because JSON is text only, it can easily be sent to and from the server, and is used as a data format in any programming language. JavaScript has a built-in function here, JSON.parse, that converts a string written in the JSON format into native JavaScript objects, which then makes it really easy for you to work with in JavaScript. So anybody that's familiar with JavaScript, like we are getting familiar with in this class, will be able to work with that really, really easily. Another thing that's really nice is that JavaScript doesn't need to know what kind of technology is being used on the server side, because everything is just coming back in the form of JSON. So it doesn't matter what's happening with the server, it always comes back in the same form, so it makes it really, really easy to work with. Something that's just a little tip here that one of my coworkers told me about was that in interviews, it's very common that they might ask you if you know how to work with RESTful APIs. And RESTful APIs are just APIs that use JSON to pass data. So I guess that's a common interview question, and hopefully that's helpful to you, because now we'll be learning about JSON and we will all know how to work with RESTful APIs. Okay, so here is an example of code that I was able to find this example online, and then I built it myself, and this helped me kind of understand a little bit more of how JSON works. So let's pretend that you have an encyclopedia of flowers, and it's a physical book, and you want to put it online. So this right here is in JavaScript, how an example of one of those flowers. So we have we're creating this flower object here, and we're calling it a sunflower. That's the name, and then here's the color and how we want to describe it there. And then we just create this function to actually have it draw the flower so that we can see it. But this is really inconvenient because, like I said, we have this encyclopedia of flowers, and so we might have thousands of flowers in there. And if we inputted all of our information into a JavaScript file like this, it would be huge, and we don't want to have all of that sitting in our code. So, especially because then we want to print it out and make it look pretty on a web page. So, we want to put it into a separate file. So we have our flower.js here, and now we're going to create a flower.json. And it's just the information here that later can be loaded into an object in our JavaScript, but we're going to store it in our JSON for now. And there's not a variable name in this file. We just start and end our JSON with these brackets, or the curly braces, and we have our keys are all right here, and our values all right here, just like we talked about before. So now it will load the JSON. So then we'll be able to load our JSON file using this notation over here. So instead of keeping in our previous example all of the information about our object flower, we're just going to say now our variable flower equals load JSON, and then we're going to load our flower.json file that we had created in the last slide. So we'll get an object back from here, and then we'll be able to draw and use our keys in this draw function down below, and then still be able to print off the flower like we had done when everything was all stored in our JavaScript file before. But there's a little problem here with this code, and the issue is that if we run it like this, calling our load JSON function up here, we'll get an error because the load JSON can take a really long time to execute. I mean, a really long time. It doesn't necessarily mean minutes and minutes, but there's a lot of information that's coming through that it's trying to execute. And so the problem is that if that hasn't finished loading yet, our code is going to continue to go down line by line, and it's going to get down to here and want to use flower.r, but guess what? That is in our flower.json, and so if it hasn't finished loading, we'll get an error, and it'll think that our values are null because this hasn't completed loading yet. So this isn't how we want to do it. We would use this function over here instead called preload, which basically is just saying that, hey, we're going to make sure that we load all of our JSON before we go ahead and finish executing the code. And according to the person that gave this example online, this might not be the absolute best way to do it, but it's a way that works for now in our simple terms that we're going to use. Before I finish up, I just have one small little helper piece of information that I found online. So your JSON can get really long and really, really complicated because you can have your arrays, your objects, your strings, and it can all be loaded in there. It's not going to be nearly as simple as my flower example here. So you can go to a website like this. I just Googled JSON formatter, so here's an example. JSONformatter.curiousconcept.com. But basically you can copy or load the file into this formatter, and then it will help you find maybe where you might have a slight typo in your JSON if you were actually creating it and building it yourself. And so because you might not always get the best errors in whatever program you're using to build it, but if you run it here on one of these formatting places, it can help you figure out how to format it best so that it will execute properly and not just have one little tiny error that messes up the whole thing. So that's just a little bit of advice that I found online that I thought would be really helpful to know. So this is the end of my very brief, simple introduction to JSON. I've really liked learning about it because I always hear JSON, that term, thrown around at my job, and I've never really understood what it means. But now I feel like I can grasp the concept a little bit better, and I can already see how we will be able to apply this specifically to our weather site assignment that we've been working on. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.